urbanization. What does urban mean?
Like city.
Yeah, a city. So urbanization is going to be the increase of population into urban areas. So people are going to be moving from the countryside into the cities. Now, why would someone move from the countryside to the city?
For like a better job.
Yeah, to get jobs. They're losing their land. Their estates are being bought up. The commons have been bought up after the enclosure movement. And so they're moving to the cities to find jobs. But the problem with those jobs is that it's unskilled labor. So are you going to be paid a lot for those jobs in the city?
No.
No. So you're going to be a part of the working class, the proletariat. Okay, not a lot of money. Your living conditions are going to for lack of a better word, suck. Okay, so the factory system, which is the system that replaced the cottage industry, moving from producers to consumers, moving from working in the home to working in factories, is going to change small towns into crowded cities. So people are going to start moving into these cities for work. Okay, so here we have an example of Manchester in 1820. In 1665, they had about 6,000 people. By the end of the first industrial revolution, they had over 250,000 people. Okay, that is a big change over time. And so we see that these cities are not going to be equipped for this larger population. And it's going to lead to some pretty gross living conditions. So one of the main images that we get from the Industrial Revolution is inhumane living conditions. There aren't enough buildings, and so the streets are going to get really crowded as new, not really fancy tenements are going to be built. So these are hastily constructed and they're crowded, and there aren't really any building inspection rules for how they're constructed. So they're also going to be very unsafe. Okay, so tenements are like slums. These are the places where the working class are going to be forced to live because they're cheap and they're available. Okay, unsafe water and a lack of hygienic conditions and a lack of sanitation is going to lead to the spread of certain diseases, most notably cholera. Y'all, this is SFI. It is a name of a disease during the Industrial Revolution. So this would be good SFI if you're given a question on the Industrial Revolution. So unsafe water is going to lead to the proliferation of the spread of cholera, and that's going to lead to a lot of death, particularly since you have these tenements that are just packed with people. Okay, we're talking about a floor of a building having like 13 families and only one toilet. Okay, some of the rooms that the families are living in don't have windows or circulation. They're throwing waste out the windows into the street below. And then people in the street below are getting hit by that waste, or if they're kids, they're playing in it. Okay, so here in this quote, you went down one step even from the foul area into the cellar in which a family of human beings lived. So there are people living in basements. It was very dark inside. The window panes, many of them were broken and stuffed with rags. The smell was so foul as to almost knock the two men down. They began to penetrate the thick darkness of the place and to see 3 or 4 little children rolling on the damp, wet brick floor, through which the stagnant, filthy moisture of the street oozed up. So you have kids playing in doo-doo water. They are going to catch cholera. So you're going to have very, very inhumane living conditions. The cities are going to be filled with disease, and a lack of wages and employment is going to make people desperate, which is going to make them turn to crime. Okay, so you're going to have some negative effects due to urbanization. Also, as people start flooding into the cities, the government is going to start rapidly building buildings, okay, and transportation. It's going to become very crowded. So you have rapid urbanization, and you don't have proper public transportation, which is going to make the conditions even worse as it gets overcrowded and people try to live close to their jobs, because if there's no public transportation, then they have to be able to walk to their jobs. So they're working 16 hours a day and they live right near their jobs. So since Britain was the first country to go through the Industrial Revolution, obviously they're going to be the ones that first deal with this urban challenge of how do we respond to the effects of the Industrial Revolution as it relates to a growth in population within the city. Other countries are going to see this happening with Britain, and so they're going to get ahead of the problem. But Britain doesn't have anyone else to copy because they're the first ones going through it. However, governments are going to be very, very slow to improve sanitation and to set up building code inspections. Now, why would the government be slow to take this step? It costs money, and under laissez-faire capitalism, is the government supposed to get involved in the economy? No, they're supposed to stay with a hands-off approach. Interfering and trying to improve the conditions of the working class, they believed would in the long run hurt society as a whole. But eventually they are going to be forced to respond to these conditions. It's in their best interest. So by the 1820s, about halfway through the first industrial revolution, governments are going to start reforming. They're going to start responding to these urban conditions. There was an English social reformer by the name of Edwin Chadwick, just amazing hair, right? He is going to push for these reforms, including a reform that's going to help with the spread of cholera. He is going to issue the Chadwick Report, which is going to lead to the Public Health Act of 1848. And in this Public Health Report, it's going to say, hey, so cholera, turns out that's spread by dirty water. How do we stop the spread of cholera? We need to improve the sewage systems. Instead of throwing our doo-doo into the streets, we need to have a proper way to get rid of all of this waste so that we don't keep spreading these diseases. Just mind blown, right? Lightning bulb idea. Okay, so this is going to improve sanitation. Thus, it's going to lead to a drop in the spread of cholera. Okay, so in a positive effect. Whenever you see this word reform with an exclamation point, that's an important part of the slide. Okay, reforms are going to be effects of the Industrial Revolution. They're slow to occur because the government is reluctant to get involved in regulating the economy, okay, but they are going to be significant. Urban planners are going to start planning around the city. So the city rapidly became very crowded, very dirty, and so the government hired urban planners to try to work around this through the institution of public parks, boulevards, things to make the city seem nicer and more pleasant with more leisure activities, and demolishing buildings to make sure that the new buildings are built to code. So kind of trying to decrease the congestion of the cities that resulted from the increased population. We're also going to see the building of infrastructure in the form of mass public transport. During the second industrial revolution, we move away from steam power with the use of coal towards electricity. With electricity, we're going to have the invention of the electric trolley. This is going to be a form of public transportation that allows workers to live farther away from their place of work. Okay, so you have less crowding as people try to live near the factories that they work at. So they're going to be able to move out into the suburbs, which is going to help relieve with the overcrowding of the city itself, okay, because they have access to cheap and reliable public transport. Good so far? So Europe's population is going to skyrocket due to the increased agricultural output. You're going to see an increase in the standard of living as goods become more quickly produced, and thus costs for those goods is going to decrease. So we see a change over 100 years from 193 million people to 423 million people. Okay, that is a huge population boom. That is going to contribute to the crowding of the cities. Again, for the AP exam, you don't need to memorize these numbers. You just need to know the general trend. Population increased. Cities became more crowded. By 1914, so the beginning of World War I, 80% of the British, 60% of the Germans, which Germany became a thing in 1871, and 45% of the French lived in cities. So whereas before in period 2, we see more people living in the countryside, more feudalistic systems and networks set up. Now we're starting to see higher populations within a concentrated area. Now the working class is going to get the short end of the stick, but the middle class is actually going to do fairly well during this time period. You have the very, very rich at the top, then you have the very, very poor at the bottom, but you do have an increasing middle class. During this time period, the middle class is going to be characterized by consumerism and leisure. Consumerism referring to the fact that they don't produce their own goods anymore. Okay, instead, they can buy them for cheaper with less hassle because of the speed with which things can be created in the factory system. And they're going to start looking for leisure activities for when they're not at work. So like traveling to the countryside on the weekend using public transportation, going to one of the public parks that has been created by the urban planners in order to mitigate the urban overcrowding. We're also going to see a difference between the working class and the middle class when it comes to gender. Now in the working class, every member of the family had to work. The men worked, the women worked, the children worked. They're all working in the factories, 16-hour days, 6 days a week. They get Sundays off. Okay, you couldn't afford to let your wife stay at home because you needed that income. The middle class is not going to have that issue. This is going to lead to the cult of domesticity. This is something you'll need to know for AP US history as well. The idea that a woman's role is to stay at home, while the husband's role is to go to work. So the woman's role is going to revolve around the household. It's going to revolve around the children. And they're allowed that because they don't have to work or provide an income for the family to survive. Obviously, the upper class and the middle class are going to have this option. It's going to become seen as a status symbol. The fact that you can allow your wife to stay at home because you can support the family on one income is going to be a sign of how well-to-do you are. But the proletariat or the working class is not going to have that luxury. So when we talk about the middle class, y'all have probably heard this term before, the bourgeoisie. Okay, so if you've ever heard of like someone being bougie, it's referring to the middle class. They're going to enjoy a period of prosperity, increased income, increased political representation, especially due to the Enlightenment as we move away from autocratic, absolute monarchs to constitutional representation in the government. And they're going to see an increase in leisure time. In particular, we're going to see the captains of industry emerge. These are the people who create the factory system and own the capital and the means of production. Particularly in United States history, they're going to be people like John Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie, okay, the big names that start these monopolies in oil and steel and railroads or banking. Okay, so the same thing's going to happen in Britain. Now, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, is going to be divided into two parts. You're going to have upper middle class and you're going to have lower middle class. The upper middle class was known as the haute bourgeoisie. This included bankers, merchants, and industrialists. So the people who own factories, okay, the people who are making a lot of money. They're not low nobles, they don't have noble titles, but they have a lot of income. In contrast, the lower middle class is going to be known as the petite bourgeoisie. They're not factory workers. Okay, they're not working 16-hour days. These are usually skilled laborers, shopkeepers, artisans, clergy members. So they're not going to be the working class that's stuck in the factories. So keep in mind that there are two classes within the middle class. The middle class is going to represent less than a fifth of British society, okay? And they are not going to be on the side of the working class. They're very slowly going to come around to the idea that unfettered capitalism is bad for society as a whole. okay, especially those who are part of the upper middle class, the captains of industry who own the factories. They're not going to want the government to enact reforms because those reforms will cut into their profits, things like providing gloves or hard hats or workman's comp, okay, or a minimum wage. All of that's going to cut into the profit of the factory owners. And so the government is going to be reticent to try and institute those reforms, but eventually the working class is going to gain enough support that they're going to be able to push those reforms through, particularly in the 1840s. So why were the capitalists so against economic interference? Well, that dates back to the emergence of laissez-faire capitalism. Okay, and these entrepreneurs are all going to share these ideas. Y'all may remember that there was a change over time from period 2 into period 3, from mercantilism to capitalism. Now, under mercantilism, the government is supposed to control the economy. They have colonies that are captive markets. The colonies need to buy manufactured goods from the mother country. And the colonies need to provide raw materials to the mother country because that's the purpose of the colonies. Well, Adam Smith, a physiocrat during the Enlightenment, is going to say, actually, no, let's apply these natural laws that we got from the Enlightenment beyond just science and society. Let's apply it to the economy. And so he wrote The Wealth of Nations, saying, hey, the market should regulate itself, the government should take a hands-off approach, and we should allow the law of supply and demand to dictate prices. Okay, now this is a different type of capitalism than what is followed today. Like, obviously we have child labor laws. Okay, obviously we have safety regulations, workman's comp and all of that. We have weekends off and 8-hour work days, all of that good stuff. Okay, so don't confuse this capitalism with the type that's used in the modern day, because obviously there's going to be some big issues with laissez-faire capitalism. Now, Adam Smith is going to say, hey, the invisible hand is what controls the markets, not the government. Okay, and this invisible hand knows best. Now, even though the invisible hand is supposed to control the market, Adam Smith said that the individuals involved in the economy should work morally. But even if they don't act morally, then it's still going to be more beneficial to just let the economy regulate itself, that it will ultimately benefit all of society rather than just the industrialist or the selfish individual mentioned. Okay, so here in this quote, that idea is shown. An industrialist neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. But by pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society. Okay, so society will benefit if these industrialists pursue their own personal gain. Now, is that what happened? No, society did not get better because industrialists were trying to make a profit. In fact, for a large portion of society, the conditions got worse, particularly with the working class. However, the industrialists are going to cling to this philosophy, saying, hey, this is the prominent economic theory. We need to follow it. So government, you need to keep your hands off of our business. You need to allow for a free market to emerge. Reforms like minimum wage or not hiring children under the age of 9 directly interferes with supply and demand. It interferes with the free market. So the government is going to be very slow to get involved. Okay, are we good so far? So if the role of the government wasn't to get involved in the economy, what was their role? Well, industrialists believed that the government was supposed to support or enforce contracts, protect private property, and ensure the national defense. What's noticeable here is that when industrialists come under fire by reform movements, they're going to call on the government to back them up. So when it comes to interfering with the economy, the government isn't supposed to do it if it cuts into profits. But once profits start being threatened by reform movements, that's when the industrialists start calling in the government, saying, hey, you need to take care of these unions, or you need to take care of this reform movement and knock it out. Okay, even though hypocritically, their reaction to calls for reforms is to say, no, 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 government can't be involved at all. Okay, so we're going to see that that is historically significant. Now, standards of living are going to improve over time as a result of the Industrial Revolution, as the cost of goods decreases and become more available due to inventions and technology that increase transportation and shipping. However, income distribution is going to be very uneven. What this means is that there are going to be the haves and the have-nots. The people who have a lot. Okay, they hold a lot of the wealth in society. The people who are the have-nots have very, very little. So on one end of the spectrum, you have people that seem like crazy, stupid rich, and they have mansions and they have chariots, and they're hosting parties where they have little trays of sand and they put gemstones in them for people to hunt like Easter eggs. And then you have 13 families living in a tenement with one bathroom. Okay, so very different ends of the spectrum. Okay, so the idea is going to develop that, well, what if we more equally distributed that income, okay, in order to increase or to better society as a whole? But there are going to be many people who come out against those ideas, saying that helping the poor is actually bad for society. And this actually ties into the concept of new imperialism. I covered this last period with second period, but I'll mention it here again. The concept of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is going to emerge during this time period, and it is going to be used as a justification for what the industrialized nations do to other countries, particularly to their colonies. Social Darwinism is basically a form of racism. Y'all may have heard of Darwin. He came up with the idea of evolution, right? That certain traits are passed down through generations that benefit the species as a whole, and traits that don't benefit the species end up dying out. Well, y'all may have also heard the term survival of the fittest. Darwin never said survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest was coined by Herbert Spencer, a social Darwinist. He said, hey, if this applies to species of birds, why don't we apply it to humans? Are there any traits that humans have been passed down from generation to generation that makes them more suitable for society? Well, guess who he said was the cream of the crop?
White folk.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so people in the industrialized nations like Caucasian people and rich people. So he said, if you're rich, then you deserve to be rich, because you must have some sort of trait that makes you better than everybody else. And you should be the one having more kids because your genetic makeup is better for the human species as a whole. But poor people, Herbert Spencer is going to blame and say they're poor because they lack genetic desirability. They have negative traits that makes them a pollution on the human species. And they're also going to use this in new imperialism to justify the atrocities that are committed against people in the African and Asian colonies by saying, oh, we're naturally better because we've colonized the world. We're in charge because we must be superior. In reality, it has nothing to do with that. Okay, that's going to relate when it comes to the economy, because there are going to be some philosophers who come out and say basically the same thing of poor people are bad. We shouldn't help the poor people. We should just let them die and we'll be better off as a society. Obviously, very gross take. Okay, so the first person we're going to look at who has a hot take on poor people is Thomas Malthus. Now, Thomas Malthus is going to claim that there's a limited amount of food, and that as population increases, we are limiting those resources, and that these resources grow at different rates. The human population grows geometrically, but the food supply moves arithmetically. Don't think I said that right. Okay, so principle of population. Population goes from 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16. It doubles, okay? Food, however, grows at a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rate. And so eventually you're going to have more people than food. Now, the world puts in natural checks on population. These are called positive checks on population. So when the population gets too big, nature intercedes, and there's war that drops the population, or famine that drops the population, or disease. So he said the power of population is so superior to the power of the earth to produce food for man that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race. So he says that once the population surpasses the food supply, nature will get involved and start killing people. The evils of mankind are active and able ministers of depopulation. But should they fail in this war of extermination, sickly seasons, epidemics, pestilence, and plague advance in terrific array and sweep off their tens or thousands and tens of thousands. Should success still be incomplete, gigantic inevitable famine stalks in the rear and with one mighty blow levels the population with the food of the world. So he says that nature naturally checks our population, that when we get too many people, they're going to start dying off. And he says that this is just the natural order of events. Well, were there people starving and dying off during the Industrial Revolution? Yeah, the working class. Okay, they were being paid very, very little. And they were living in terrible conditions, full of doo-doo water and cholera, okay, spreading throughout the tenements. But did Thomas Malthus say, hey, we should probably do something about this? We should help the poor so they don't die? No, his response was, let them die. That's what nature do. Okay, because if you help them, then you're only going to make things worse. If you allow poor people to live, then we're eventually going to run out of resources. So let nature take its course and take them out. Okay, so the human population would inevitably outstrip the food production, and thus misery and famine are inevitable. So if we want to prevent that, we have to allow people to die off. Pretty gross take. In all societies, there's a constant effort towards an increase of population. This constant effort tends to subject the lower classes of society to distress and to prevent any great permanent amelioration of their condition. Okay, so basically saying you shouldn't help the poor because we need this population to go down. This is going to be used by industrialists to argue to the government, hey, stop trying to regulate us. Stop trying to put in reforms that helps the working class, because look, the thinkers of the day are saying that you're actually hurting society as a whole by helping them. Another major thought of the time is going to be espoused by David Ricardo, and this deals with wages. He is going to come up with the iron law of wages, and he is going to base his ideas on Malthus's view of the working class. With the iron law of wages, like food, there is a limited supply. And if you have too many people, okay, you're not going to have enough money for everybody. He claims that there is a limited amount of money. Okay, so labor is a commodity. Labor is something you can buy or sell. The price of your labor is determined by supply and demand. So if I try to get a job at Arby's right now, I mean, well, they're hiring. They are desperately looking for employees, right? There's for hire signs all over Montgomery. I could probably get paid more. I could probably get paid above maybe the minimum wage because they need reliable workers. So that supply and demand works in my favor. But what if there aren't a lot of jobs in Montgomery? Okay, there's too many people and not enough jobs. That means that I may have to take a lower paying job because that's all that I can get. Okay, so my labor is a commodity that I can sell, but the price of that commodity changes according to the environment. He claimed that if you increase wages for the working class, that's going to have a negative effect, that it's going to lead to workers having more children. A rise in wages from an alteration in the value of money produces a general effect on price, and for that reason, it produces no real effect whatsoever on profits. So increasing the pay for labor by the working class is only going to encourage them to have more children. Well, if you have more children, then your labor supply is going to increase and there's not going to be enough jobs. So as the supply of workers increases, their wages eventually start to decline because there's too many people in the workforce, because the amount of money that's available is limited. So he's saying, should we raise wages for the working class? No, because if the working class gets more money, then they're going to have more kids. That's going to lead to wages dropping. That is the iron law of wages. So really, there's no way for the working class to improve their future. Yet another argument against reforms. Part of the reason why the reform movement is going to be so slow. So his beliefs and Malthus's beliefs are going to be used by industrialists to oppose labor unions that emerged and to oppose raising wages and instituting safety regulations into the economy. So unfettered, laissez-faire capitalism. Are we good so far? Now, eventually the working class is going to get sick and tired of being sick and tired. Okay, working 16-hour days, 6 days a week for very little money. And so they're going to organize and they're going to push for reforms. So the working class, or the proletariat, one of your vocabulary words, type it in the chat, is going to combine together. Now, the working class makes up a large portion of the population. Okay, so there's power in numbers, but do they have like the right to vote or the right to hold office? No. Okay, do they have money and resources to get them political power? No. Okay, so they're going to have to take a different approach. The working class did not have political power in the government because they did not have the right to vote, because they were not property owners, but they do have the numbers. They have a large portion of the population. So some utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, John Stuart Mill is the more popular of the two, believed that to make a perfect society or an ideal society, you need to maximize happiness and reduce suffering. Sounds simple, right? Increase the happy, decrease the sad. And so they're going to encourage the government doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Okay, not the capitalists, not the industrialists, because they make up a small percentage of the population. The majority of the population is working class. So the utilitarians say, hey, maybe we should help out the working class. Maybe we can provide a social safety net for people, like unemployment perhaps, or safety regulations within the factories. Okay, eventually this is going to lead to the development of socialism and eventually communism. Frederick Engels is going to work with Karl Marx on the development of that philosophy. He is going to write a book in 1844 called The Condition of the Working Class in England that details the rise of the proletariat against the industrial class. The history of the proletariat in England begins with the invention of the steam engine and of machinery for working cotton. These inventions gave rise to an industrial revolution, a revolution which altered the whole civil society, the historical importance of which is only now beginning to be recognized. England is the classic soil of this transformation, i.e., the Industrial Revolution started in England, and England is therefore the classic land of its chief product, the proletariat. We get the proletariat from the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution gave us the factory system, which gave us the working class. Only in England can the proletariat be studied in all its relations and from all sides. So his argument, his thesis, this was his context up here. How did we get the proletariat? The Industrial Revolution, the inventions. The middle class, the English middle class, especially in the manufacturing class, which is enriched directly by the means of the poverty of the workers, persists in ignoring this poverty. So he's saying the rich people aren't going to help the working class. The middle class aren't going to help the working class because they are benefiting from the factory system. And so the proletariat are going to have to rise up themselves to take over the means of production. And one example in which they do that is with the development of the Luddites. Now, the Luddites are going to respond to the conditions of the Industrial Revolution with violence. Okay, the Luddites are led by a man named Ned Ludd, and they are going to go around destroying the machines that took their jobs. Okay, so they're very anti-machine. These Luddites move into the early factories and they destroy the spinning jennies and the water frames and all of those things because It's getting their skilled labor to be changed to unskilled labor. And they're willing to use violence and intimidation in order to get what they want. So here's a letter sent to a mill owner in 1812. Information has just been given that you are the owner of those detestable shearing frames, and I have been asked by my men to give you a warning to pull them down. If they're not taken down by the end of next week, I shall send at least 200 men to destroy them. If you fire at my men, they have orders to murder you and burn all your houses. Go to your neighbors and inform them that the same fate awaits them if their frames are not taken down. Okay, so they're trying to use violence and intimidation to stop the Industrial Revolution. Now, is that going to work? No. Okay, but it does tap into this frustration felt by the working class as machines begin replacing them. This forces them into unskilled labor, which forces them to accept lower wages and thus be moved into the working class. Despite this, however, industrialization is going to continue, and Parliament intercedes in the economy. They're not going to back the working class. Instead, they're going to back the capitalists. They're going to make the destruction of these machines a capital offense. So they are protecting the interests of the industrialists. Eventually, the workers are going to realize that violence is not going to be the best way to get what they want in terms of reforms. And so instead, they're going to start organizing politically through the establishment of labor unions. And the goal of these labor unions is going to include better working conditions and higher wages. So what we're going to see here is that the capitalists want to make as much profit as possible, and they're going to use laissez-faire economic theory to try and keep the government out of the economy. Now, obviously, this is going to lead to problems for the working class. And so the working class doesn't have any political power because they can't vote, they don't own property, but they do have power in numbers. And so they are going to start organizing and forming unions in order to try to compel the government to act on their behalf, to get into regulating the economy for the betterment of society. Okay, so if you enjoy having weekends, if you enjoy having Labor's Day, out of school and off of work, if you enjoy having 8 hours to work and then the rest of the day is yours, then you can thank labor unions for that. If you enjoy not having to work from ages like 7 to 60 in a factory or in a mine, okay, you have labor unions to thank for that. They are going to implement new government regulations that puts a limit on child labor, allows for public education of children instead of them working in factories and mines, and it's going to lead to increased wages and better working conditions. But it is going to be very, very difficult to enact because the government is going to side with the industrialists. And that's because the Industrial Revolution was funded by people with capital, the entrepreneurs who created the technology like the water frame and the spinning jenny and the steam engine in order to make the Industrial Revolution possible. The private individuals are also going to invest a lot in infrastructure and other funding for the Industrial Revolution. So the government and the capitalists are going to work hand in hand. The working class is going to have an uphill battle to fight in getting better working conditions. For example, in 1799, Parliament is going to pass the Combination Acts, which is going to prevent unions. It's going to make unions illegal. This is following the Luddite reform movement when a group of workers who did not want to be replaced by machines started leading armies, attacking factories and attacking machines. But that violent protest is not going to be enough to stop the Industrial Revolution. And so the government is going to make destruction of factory machines a capital offense. Hence why the British workers tried to unionize peacefully. But of course, they are going to face some obstacles along the way, like the fact that organizing as a union is going to be made illegal. Now, eventually that law is going to be overturned. Okay, so whenever you see these words with in red with reform, that is historical significance. So this is a change over time. Parliament is going to repeal the Combination Acts of 1799 and allow for organizations of unions. And it's only because the working class banded together and had strength in numbers. Okay, by 1875, the British trade unions are going to gain full legal status, which is going to include the right to strike. What does it mean to strike? Or to go on strike? To protest and to refuse to work. Now, for a strike to be successful, you have to have a large amount of people who participate in it. What if I decided to go on strike and I was like, I'm not going to show up for the rest of the school year? Well, they could probably cover my position. They'd probably be like, okay, well, we're going to get Mr. Baker to cover her 6th period and Miss McIntyre to cover her 3rd period. They would be able to fill in the gaps that's left by my protest. But what if every single teacher protested and went on strike? Well, then can't hold school because there aren't enough teachers for school to be held. And so then the system might be more likely to listen to our demands. Okay, so that's how strikes are going to work. Now, unfortunately for the unions, there's going to be such a thing as strike breakers, where there's such a large labor pool that if their workers go on strike, the capitalists can just fire them and then hire a bunch of new people so that it doesn't cut into their profits. Okay, so the fact that there's such a large labor supply is going to hamper some of the union's efforts with these strikes. But despite these obstacles, these unions are going to be successful in implementing important labor reform. One of the most prominent unions in Britain is known as the Chartists. Okay, so these are British workers who become directly involved in defending their interests, directly involved in political activity. So trying to petition the government to get these changes made. Okay, this is going to be in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. So by 1836, the Chartist movement is going to start pushing for universal male suffrage. What does suffrage mean? The right to vote. This is not the only time you're going to hear this word. Y'all, this is a big deal in American history. So if you didn't know what suffrage was before, now you better know. Go ahead and soak it up into your brains and remember it for next year. Suffrage is the right to vote. Now, prior to 1836, the only people who had the right to vote were white men with property. Same thing in America, okay? It's not until Andrew Jackson becomes president that suffrage is expanded to every white man in America, regardless of how much property they hold. But at first, the right to vote and the right to participate in government was held by people with capital, with land, or with wealth. So the government didn't feel like it had to listen to the lower classes because the lower classes didn't have to vote. You don't have to campaign to the lower classes because they have no political power. And so the Chartists tried to change this by saying, hey, we need the right to vote, and then politicians will be forced to respond to our demands. Because if they don't, we have the numbers and we can put them out of office. Now, obviously, the industrialists are not going to be too fond of this plan. Okay, but the Chartists are going to move forward with their People's Charter. This is going to be drafted in 1838, and it is going to be a radical campaign to increase government influence within the Industrial Revolution. So some of the things that they wanted included votes for all men. Note here who's left out. Women are still left out. Okay, we're not going to see suffrage for women until we move into period 4, particularly in the United States. They don't get it till 1920. Okay, so votes for all men, regardless of how much money they have or if they have property. Equal electoral districts. Okay, so no gerrymandering. Abolition of the requirement that members of parliament be property owners. So it can't just be rich people running the government. You need to allow people who don't own property to run for office. Payment for members of parliament. Before the Charters Revolution, if you worked as a government official, you didn't get a salary. Now, some people might be like, okay, that's good because then they're less corrupt. Well, if you can afford to not have to work, okay, then you have a certain amount of privilege. So people who can't afford to take a year or whatever for their term off of work are not going to be able to run for office. people with money can take that time off and hold political office without having to work a job on the side. Okay, so by adding a salary for the members of parliament, this is going to open up positions for the lower class. They also wanted annual general elections. Now, this is one of the parts of the Chartist, the People's Charter that's not going to be implemented. Okay, the reason for this is that if you have yearly elections, you're probably not going to be able to get much done as a politician because you're going to be too busy campaigning for your next election to actually do your job. Okay, so they're not going to implement that aspect of the People's Charter. They are, however, going to implement the secret ballot. What a secret ballot means is that no one can see how you vote. That's what we have today. Okay, poll watchers aren't allowed to be behind your shoulder as you're penciling in who you're voting for. Okay, your employer doesn't get to know who you voted for or what you voted for because that could be intimidation. Okay, and so you don't want intimidation playing a role in how you vote. So it should be a secret ballot. So all of these are going to be implemented except for the yearly general elections. Okay, so the Chartist movement is going to be very powerful and very popular, and it's going to spread throughout England and even be the source of riots. So we are going to have some violence break out in response to fighting for workers' rights, because the Chartists are going to hold lectures, and eventually those lectures are going to get rowdy because they're going to demand that the government interfere and listen to their demands. So here, for instance, you see someone preparing for a Chartist lecture who's strapping the top of a pot cover to his chest and some welding equipment and bringing a sword, okay, because things could get violent. Okay, so the use of violence in reforms is not something that is new, okay, when it comes to demanding rights for the working class. So the government response to this is going to be, okay, we need to do something about these unions. We need to give in to some of their demands at the very least so that they stop pushing so hard. Okay, so the government is going to abolish slavery in British colonies. Now, this wasn't because they're like, oh, slavery is bad, right? It is because there was an economic reason behind it. If you're a worker in Britain, you can't compete with free labor. Okay, there's nothing cheaper than free. Okay, and so in order to help raise wages in Britain, Britain outlaws slavery, okay, so that they don't have to compete with the working class. They're also going to create the Sadler Commission to look into working conditions, to go into the factories and see what's going wrong and to answer some of the demands for improved working conditions. They're going to issue the Factory Act in 1833, which bans child labor. The New Poor Law in 1834, which is going to help out with improving the tenements, to help with housing relief for the working class. And the Reform Bill, which is going to expand suffrage for people living within urban areas. Okay, so it takes a really long time to get these reforms. It takes revolution, it takes rioting, it takes pressure on the government. Okay, but we are going to see some changes implemented. Eventually, by 1867, the Prime Minister is going to further that reform through his Reform Bill of 1867. He's going to expand suffrage to most of the male urban workers. So if you work in a city and you are male, doesn't matter if you don't have property, doesn't matter if you're not wealthy, you still get the right to vote. Now, obviously, the capitalists, the industrialists are not going to be very fond of that, because the power to vote is a power to control government. And very clearly, the working class is going to vote in favor of things like working conditions reforms and other reforms that benefit the people who work in the factories as opposed to the people who own the factories. Another offshoot of the reform movement that's going to emerge during this time is socialism. So we're going to see the rise of socialism as a direct response to the Industrial Revolution. So this is one of the effects. So socialism is a system, and the definition's over here, a system in which major resources and industries would be owned by the workers, so the workers or the proletariat controlling the means of production, or owned by the government on the behalf of all people. So rather than these factories being owned by wealthy industrialists, the government or the workers who are doing the actual work and generating the profit would be in control of the means of production and thus be able to distribute those resources more equitably across society. Now, there is a difference between socialism and communism. With socialism, they want to implement their reforms by working through the government, working through the existing system. So y'all may know of a famous socialist in America, Bernie Sanders. Is he leading riots or a military against the government to overthrow it in a coup? No, he is running for election. He is getting elected and then implementing bills and having those bills voted upon. Okay, socialism works within the network of the government system in which it exists. Okay, so it's slow, gradual change through the existing structure. Communism is different. Communism is where they want immediate change, and they're willing to use violence to enact that change. So an example of this would be the overthrow of the Romanov dynasty in Russia, okay, where they were murdered by the Communist Party as they took power and established the USSR. That's definitely not working within the system. That's completely overhauling the system through the use of violence. So socialism is slower, more gradual. Communism is faster and more bloody. So socialist beliefs. The socialists believe that there is unequal distribution of wealth in industrialized societies, and that unequal distribution is unjust. There are some people who have a lot, some people have a minimal amount, and then some people who have the least amount. And most of the population is going to fall in this lower class, and their working conditions and living conditions are going to be inhumane. So they claim that the haves, the people at the top of society, have more than they need to survive, okay, which at this point in time is true. Okay, the capitalists and industrialists amass massive wealth, and they build mansions and they buy up estates and they have carriages with horses and manors. So yes, clearly that is more than you technically need to survive. Now the issue here isn't, oh, some people have more stuff. With socialism, the issue is that there are some people who don't have enough. If the haves wanted to have mansions and, you know, golden plates, that's perfectly fine, as long as there wasn't a subclass of society that was doing without, okay, especially without enough to live. So the have-nots, the working class, are living in crowded tenements, dying of cholera and pneumonia. There's doo-doo water throughout the streets. They don't have enough food. They're working for 16 hours a day. Clearly, these opposite ends of the spectrum are extremes. So they believe that the solution of that is to distribute the excess that the upper class has to the lower class, so that there is no lower class, so that everyone will move down to this middle class and everyone will have what they need to survive. Okay, the resources or the means of production in the Industrial Revolution are being held by a privileged few. They're being held by the capitalists, by the bourgeoisie. But the bourgeoisie are not the ones who are doing the work that generates all of this profit. So the socialists believe that the working class should own the means of production. The community should own the factories rather than one person, so that those profits can be equally distributed amongst the people who generate the profits in the first place. Now, this obviously is going to take government planning of the economy. So this is going to be the opposite of laissez-faire communism. Laissez-faire capitalism. Under laissez-faire capitalism, the government's not supposed to be involved. The government is supposed to stay hands-off. Under socialism, the government should be involved. The government should try to benefit the whole of society and thus plan the economy not to enrich a few individuals, but to benefit the majority of the population. Therefore, the profits that come from this human labor, the profits that come from the factory system, should be distributed equitably. That doesn't mean that everybody gets paid the same amount. It's more so the case of everybody gets what they need to survive, kind of like with the equal field system in China that worked for 100 years before government corruption undermined it. If you have a large family, clearly you're going to need more land because you need more food. If you're living by yourself, just one person, you don't need a mansion. Okay, you don't need that much land. Or like in Africa with the community ownership of land. Okay, people didn't own land because that wasn't a concept of owning land. It was for the betterment of the community. So if you have a large family with a lot of animals and a lot of children and a lot of wives or what have you, then you obviously would need more land than somebody who has one chicken and no children, right? Same thing with the Native American societies, the idea of ownership of property. Not a thing. It was supposed to be distributed amongst the community. So a lot of people confuse socialism with, oh, that means everyone gets paid exactly the same and there's no individuality and all that. That's not what it means. It means to each what they can do and to each what they need. So what are your skill sets? That's going to be your job. What do you need to survive? That's what you're going to be given. Okay? So socialism is going to take many different forms, but the working class obviously is going to find socialism to be very appealing because it stands to benefit them the most. It says that the society that they're living in right now is unjust, that they don't get everything that they need to survive, and that there is a solution to that problem. And so some people are going to try to implement that socialist solution through utopian socialism. Does anyone know what a utopia is? A paradise or an ideal situation. Exactly, TJ. So this is the belief that somehow the government or society can create a utopia. Now, is this ever going to happen? No. Okay, we are not going to be able to create a perfect society. Okay, it is an imperfect world, but people are at least going to try. Okay, I respect that. Trying to make society better, always a good idea. So utopian societies or socialists, words, are going to advocate for social and economic planning, and their end goal is a perfect society. Obviously, if your goal is perfection, you are going to fail, okay, because nobody is perfect. But I guess shoot for the stars or shoot for the moon and you'll land amongst the stars. So they plan on basing these societies on cooperation rather than competition. Okay, cooperating amongst the different branches of government and industry rather than trying to increase competition for the goal of increasing profits. Okay, so one such socialist, Count Henry de Saint-Simon, is going to argue that there is such a thing as a hand of greed, that there are parasites within industrialized society that are hurting society as a whole. Now, much like the Chinese considered merchants to be parasitic because they don't produce anything, they simply sell things that other people have produced, Saint-Simon is going to believe that the industrialists are in that same vein, that like the merchants in China, they should be at the bottom of society because they are parasitic. The whole of society ought to strive towards the amelioration, meaning the betterment of the moral and physical existence of the poorest class. Society ought to organize itself in the way best adapted for attaining this end, so helping the lower classes. So the doers, the working class, benefit the economy. Therefore, they should control the economy. The industrialists, the capitalists, don't do the work. They simply own the means of production. They own the factories, they own the machines. They are the parasites, okay? So instead of those industrialists owning the means of production, the people who do the labor, the factory workers, should own the means of production and thus control the economy. Thus, industrialization would more equitably benefit all of society rather than just benefiting a privileged few who are going to have wealth in excess while people in the working class die in the streets of starvation and disease. Now, there are going to be some weird ideas that come out of socialism that are definitely not going to take off. Charles Fourier wants to create self-sufficient communities, which he calls phalanxes. Okay, so basically just communities with their own food and industry and basically a manor system so they don't need to move outside of the community. He's going to want to abolish marriage and basically make like a free love kind of community. These phalanxes would live in a giant hotel, and there would be over 6 million of them, and there would be one all-powerful ruler known as the omniarch. Okay, that would control all of the phalanxes in the world. Obviously, this kind of view of a utopian society is not going to come to fruition. So he's kind of just like a fun fact outside of the main ones that we talk about. Now, Louis Blanc, however, oh yes, a phalanx is a military formation if you're talking about Roman history, and that's actually where he's going to get the term from. So because it's like a grouping. Okay, so Louis Blanc from France is not going to be one of those fun facts to the side kind of socialist. He is going to be a key player in French socialism. So he believes that the working class, which is the majority of the population, should join together to peacefully take over the state. So this is not communism, because in communism, it's bloody, violent revolution. He's saying that, hey, we have the numbers, let's join together, let's organize, let's get positions in government, let's get voted in, and then we can govern and we can create a perfect society. We can create a utopian socialist society that would then govern through these social workshops. So how this would work is each person would work according to their abilities, and each person would be paid according to their needs. Okay, now, am I going to have the ability to do construction work like these people in this picture are doing? Probably not. That is not my ability. So in these social workshops, I wouldn't be assigned construction worker. I might be assigned a preschool teacher or just, general teacher for the kids who are too young to work yet in the social workshop. Okay, that is my ability. Would I be teaching math? No, that is not my ability. Okay, I might be teaching grammar or writing instead. What would I be paid? Well, let's say I'm just single with 2 cats. Am I going to be making $50 an hour? No, I don't need that much money. That's more than I need to survive. But let's say that my coworker who teaches with me has 6 kids at home and a sick husband who can't work because he doesn't have the ability to work. Well, obviously, she is going to need to take more money home than I would. So it's not in terms of like, oh, equally, you give everyone the exact same amount of money, regardless of the work that they do. Okay, you individualize it. This individual is best suited for this work, and this is how much they need for cost of living. Okay, so he's going to try to implement these social workshops in France. And at first, they are going to be successful, but then France goes through yet another revolution and the socialists are blamed for the cause of that revolution. And so it's not going to work out in the end. Okay, but they did give it the old college try with trying to create a utopia. Now, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon is going to be a very extreme view in socialism. He is going to be opposed to private property in general. Okay, so no ownership of property whatsoever. Now, a lot of people confuse this with socialism, like, oh, you can't own a shirt or you can't own, a cat or something. Like, no, that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about ownership of the means of production. So like you can't own a factory or you can't own all of the land in England. That's what it's referring to. But he is going to be very radical. Mr. Proudhon is. He is going to be against private property. He's going to be anti-religion. So not just deist, but actually like against religion. And he is going to be pro-chaos, pro-anarchy, instead of an organized government. Okay, so the whole thing that Thomas Hobbes warned against. Okay, so this is going to be a much more extreme view. Obviously, anarchy is not the best way for society to run because it will be nasty, brutish, and short. People like me would not do well in a state of anarchy because I can barely throw punches, right? That's survival of the fittest. So here he says, capital in the political field is analogous or equal to government. The economic idea of capitalism, the politics of government, the theological idea of the church are all 3 identical ideas. So he claims that the state is propped up by the government and the government is propped up by the church, and the economy is propped up by the government, all of these different things. They all work together like a triumvirate. To attack one of them is equivalent to attacking all of them. What capital does to labor, the state to liberty, the church does to the spirit. This trinity of absolutism is as baneful or bad in practice as it is in philosophy. The most effective means for oppressing the people would be to simultaneously enslave its body, its will, and its reason. Okay, so he is going to be a more radical view within socialism. He's also going to be a big fan of the thesaurus. If y'all have ever read anything where someone clearly just puts in every single word that's similar to it, like all of these synonyms, okay, he's trying to make a debate, to make a speech. It's more emotionally based than it is logically based. But just note how excessive this is. It's kind of like in Emperor's New Groove, where he's like, Cusco's poison, the poison for Cusco. You know, like you're trying to meet the word count. This is what I'm thinking of when I read this, that he was trying to meet a certain word count in his class, and so he just started putting in random mending words. To be governed is to be watched, inspected, spied upon, directed, law-driven, numbered, regulated, enrolled, indoctrinated, preached at, controlled, checked, estimated, valued, censured, commanded by creatures who have neither the right nor the wisdom nor the virtue to do so. To be governed is to be at every operation, at every transaction, noted, registered, counted, taxed, stamped, measured, numbered, assessed, licensed, authorized, admonished, prevented, forbidden, reformed, corrected, punished. It is under pretext of public utility and in the name of the general interest to be placed under contribution, drilled, fleeced, exploited, monopolized, extorted from, squeezed, hoaxed, robbed. Then at the slightest resistance, the first word of complaint, to be repressed, fined, vilified, harassed, hunted down, abused, clubbed, disarmed, bound, choked, imprisoned, judged, condemned, shot, deported, sacrificed, sold, betrayed, and to be crowned all, mocked, ridiculed, derided, outraged, dishonored. That is government. That is its justice. That is its morality. It's like, okay, I get it, my dude. You do not like government. It's like all of these things. You're shot, then you're deported, then you're sacrificed. It's like, okay. So although the utopians are going to attempt to put this philosophy into practice, all of these utopian experiments are going to fail. However, they do inspire an offshoot of socialism. They inspire the philosophy of communism. Okay, communism is going to be detailed by Karl Marx. Okay, so this is where we get Marxist socialism. This is where we get communism. Now, Marx was a German scholar and a writer, and he is going to try to create scientific socialism. He is going to develop a manifesto known as the Communist Manifesto, along with another German known as Friedrich Engels. Okay, so Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are the fathers of communism, also known as scientific socialism. Now, to create this idea, they're going to base their manifesto on a philosophy known as Historicism. Okay, Historicism was first described by a man named Hegel. Now, this is something that you're going to have to learn in AP European history as well. Basically, there's the thesis and the antithesis. They combine together to create a new thesis, and that's called synthesis. Now, I have a whole diagram that we're going to go through with that description, so I'm not going to confuse you by just trying to talk about it now. Okay, so we'll get to it in a minute. So Marx in the Communist Manifesto is going to say that the history of existing society is a history of class struggle. Okay, so a history of different classes within social stratification competing with one another for resources. So all of history is class struggle. The Industrial Revolution is going to increase this class struggle to an exorbitant degree. Okay, the gap between the classes is going to increase drastically. That's going to lead to further polarization of society. You're going to have some people with way too much, and then some people with not nearly enough. There's not a lot of people in the middle. Okay, so it's further extremes. So in this image here, we see a characterization of that gap between the societies and that class struggle. The wealthy, the upper class, are up here partying, okay, surrounded by wealth and statues and a fancy dinner, dinner jackets. But the floor that they're dancing upon is being held up by an oppressed working class. Now, for the oppressed working class to not be oppressed, they're going to have to stand up and drop that floor. So they're breaking through the floor, trying to end that class struggle, to end the oppression of the working class. Marx is going to be heavily influenced by the failed utopian socialist experiments, but also he's going to be influenced by David Ricardo. Now, I don't know if we covered that in this particular class period, but I did cover it today. Basically, David Ricardo said that there's something called the iron law of wages, that labor is something you can sell. I can sell my labor. Now, how much money I get for that labor depends on supply and demand. If there's a large demand for workers, but a low supply, then my labor is worth a lot more. If there's a large supply of workers and not a lot of jobs, then I'm competing with a bunch of other people. I'm not going to be able to get as much in wages, because I'm going to have to take a lower wage to get a job because the jobs are so rare. So Ricardo says that labor is the source of all value, and that the laws of supply and demand determine what people are paid for that labor. Marx is going to agree, but whereas Ricardo said we shouldn't raise wages because that's only going to make the iron law of wages more enforced, and poor people are only going to get poorer as a result of an increasing labor supply, Marx is going to say, actually, no, you're only half right. Labor is the source of all value, and the profit that's generated from that labor is being stolen from the laborers. So when the laborers go into work and they generate profits, most of that profit is going to the factory owner. Was the factory owner the one working in the factory? No. The only thing that the factory owner does is own the factory. Okay, going back to that idea of the parasitic capitalist class. So Marx is saying that the laborers should be getting the profits of their labor, the fruits of their labor. But instead of those profits going directly to the people who generated them, those profits instead go to someone who didn't do any of the labor. They just happen to own the factory and the machines. So he is going to claim that if labor is the source of all value, and the laborers are the ones generating that value, then profit is stolen wages. And that profit should go back to the people who actually generated the profit in the first place. Now, his ideas, his Communist Manifesto, is going to be inspired by George Hegel's study of dialectics. Again, like I said before, the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. I know this looks like antithesis, but it's pronounced antithesis, okay? So your status quo, a change, and then they compromise. Okay, so here you have the thesis. The thesis is the dominant state of affairs. It's the way that things are currently. The antithesis is a conflicting force. The antithesis is the opposite. So let's say the thesis is the Industrial Revolution. The capitalists own the factories and the working class is exploited. The antithesis is the reform movement saying, hey, we want better working conditions. We want better sanitation. We want better wages. These two are going to clash together. The thesis and the antithesis smash together and create the synthesis. This is a new state of affairs. Okay, so you have the social effects of the Industrial Revolution, bad working conditions. Reformers are asking for better working conditions. Better working conditions happen. The Factory Act of 1833 and the Sadler Commission investigating working conditions, that becomes the new state of affairs. That synthesis thus becomes the thesis. And another antithesis is going to come along, smash together with the thesis and create a new synthesis. And so it just continues from there on and there on. Does that make sense so far? All right, so Marx is going to argue that society had been split down the middle. There are two classes in society, the bourgeoisie, the people who have, and the proletariat, the people who have not. Okay. And so these two classes are in direct confrontation with each other. The bourgeoisie like the status quo because they benefit from the status quo. Their standard of living increases, they have more leisure time, and they get to generate profits. The working class, the proletariat, are going to be the antithesis. They're the ones who want reform. So the bourgeoisie are the thesis, they own the means of production, and the proletariat are the conflicting force. These two forces are going to combine together to create a new state of affairs, the synthesis. Now, Marx predicted that this synthesis is going to be a violent class struggle. So note again that in socialism, it's not violent, bloody revolution. It's working through the government gradually and peacefully. In communism, Marx says, no, okay, you're about to catch some hands. So the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are going to fight, world star, right? And in this violent class struggle, the proletariat is going to win because the proletariat has the numbers. They're the majority. So let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The workers have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. So this is going to be a global thing. It's not just going to be British communist versus German communist. He's saying that all workers, regardless of race or nationality, are on the same side, and that they need to join forces and rise up and overthrow the status quo, overthrow the bourgeoisie, and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat or a communist state. This dictatorship would eventually lead to an abolition of all classes. There would be no bourgeoisie, there would be no proletariat. There would be no haves, no have-nots. Everyone would have the means to survive. Everyone would get equitable distribution within this classless society. And this communist classless society would share work equally and share power equally, and thus they would share the profits of their labor equally. You wouldn't have to contend with the profits being stolen wages, because it wouldn't just be going to factory owners, it would go to everyone within society who generates that profit. There would be no private ownership of the means of production. There would be no private ownership of factories or land or machines. But again, note that this doesn't mean that nobody in a communist society owns anything. You're still allowed to own things. You're still allowed to buy things, right? You just can't own a factory. You can't generate profits for yourself at the expense of the working class. So it's not like they're all like, okay, here's your 5 pairs of pants and 5 pairs of shirts, and that's all you're allowed to have, and it's all a part of the community, right? You're getting wages, you're getting payment, and then you can go and buy whatever you want with that payment. Okay, they still have stores and ownership of individual items. It's just no ownership of the means of production. That belongs to society as a whole. Now, Marx and Engels are going to take a feminist perspective as well. They're going to argue that women are being exploited by capitalism, that they're not only being exploited by the patriarchy, but they're also being exploited by the Industrial Revolution, which makes sense in terms of wages during the Industrial Revolution. Men got paid more than women. They were doing the exact same work, and yet you could pay women less than half of what you would pay a man. And so Marx and Engels are going to point that out in their Communist Manifesto, that capitalism hurts women because of the exploitation not only of the working class, but also of the female gender when it comes to the wage gap. Also, communism is going to be anti-religion because they believe that it is the opium of the people, that it oppresses people by trying to keep them docile and complacent. So religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people, or the drug of the people. Okay, so it's used to maintain the status quo. Ain't no party like a communist party. Okay, so here we see some famous communists like Stalin, Fidel Castro, I believe that's Ho Chi Minh, Vladimir Lenin, and of course, Karl Marx. Okay, so we're going to see some communist states arise from this communist revolution, like the USSR, the Soviet Union, that emerges after the murder of the Romanov dynasty. Like, when you remember Anastasia Romanov from the Disney movie, at least I think it's a Disney movie. Okay. Okay, so in the last class, we talked about how socialism and communism are slightly different. Communism is scientific socialism. With socialism, they try to work peacefully and gradually. So like y'all may know Bernie Sanders, he's independent in Congress, but he identifies as a socialist. He's not leading an angry mob to overthrow the government in a military coup. Instead, he's trying to enact socialist policies through the government, through running campaigns and getting elected and passing bills, okay? Communism is going to be more aligned with violent, bloody revolution. They want change and they want it now. So in 1917, with the fall of the Romanov dynasty, okay, the Communist Party takes over and establishes the USSR, which is eventually going to be the Soviet Union that the Americans are in a Cold War against. And then in 1992, the Soviet Union falls and we have Russia again. Okay, so the socialist utopians tried to create perfect societies, but when you aim for perfection, obviously you're going to fall short of your goal. Okay, so these socialist attempts at forming a utopia are all going to fail. Now, y'all see on the slide, it says the failed socialist panacea. Does anyone happen to know what a panacea is? It's okay if you don't. I'm just seeing if anybody does. Not an ideology, but a remedy. Okay, so the socialist remedy to the, a solution. To the Industrial Revolution. There were a lot of problems that came from the Industrial Revolution. In previous classes today, I talked about how the working conditions were so terrible. The living conditions were so terrible. There was doo-doo water in the streets and everyone was dying of cholera. Okay, working 16 hours a day, 6 days out of the week with no health insurance or workman's comp and just losing life and limb left and right. Okay, so the working conditions were terrible. It was a problem for the working class. The socialists claim to have a solution to that problem, but ultimately these attempts at establishing a communist regime is going to fail. So socialists try to take advantage of a lot of revolutions that happen in the 1800s, particularly 1830s and 1848. Really, Russia is the only place that doesn't have a revolution during that time period. They maintain an absolute monarchy. Also, Britain doesn't have any revolutions during that time, like literal government revolutions outside of the Industrial Revolution. And so it's during this political upheaval in places like Germany and France and Austria that the socialist communist movement is going to try to implement their socialist agenda. Now, this agenda is going to be very popular amongst the workers because the idea of socialism is that labor is the source of value. Profits are generated by labor, but do the laborers get the profits in the factory system? No, they get paid pennies on the dollar, where the industrialists get to keep all of the profits, thus they are stealing wages. And so socialists believe that you should have more equitable distribution of those resources. So the producers in society, the proletariat, should own the means of production. You should assign work according to everyone's ability, and they should receive pay according to their needs. So if it's just me and my cats, I'm probably not going to need $50 an hour. Be nice, but I'm not going to need it. Versus my coworker who has 11 kids, okay? They would probably need a higher wage than I would, okay? I am not very good at math, so I wouldn't be assigned a job that requires a math ability. I would be assigned a job that might be more related to teaching or to social sciences. Okay, so to each to their ability, to each to their need. That is the main idea of socialism. So Karl Marx, the creator of communism or scientific socialism, is going to try to unite the proletariat together so that they can rise up and overthrow the capitalist government and establish a communist regime. So they tries to unite all socialists across all countries under an organization known as the Socialist International. Now, this is not going to be successful, and here's why. Marx claims that the working class in every country share the same goals. It doesn't matter if you're working in a factory in France, a factory in Russia, or a factory in Britain. Y'all are all on the same team. So he argues, if you all have the same superordinate goals, then why don't you work together? Well, because these workers are all going to have a stronger national identity rather than a class identity. So they care more about the fact that they're French or British or Russian than they do about their socioeconomic status. Okay, so nationalism is often going to override the socialist agenda of workers, whereas German workers and French workers and British workers should be working together in the Socialist International to implement their agenda. Unfortunately for them, that is not going to work out that way. They're still going to group themselves into different sides. Also, during the late 1800s, we're going to see reform movements, particularly in the British government. We talked earlier in the other class periods about the Chartist movement, the Sadler Commission, the Factory Act of 1833. And so some of the workers' demands are being met. They say, hey, stop making 8-year-olds work in the coal mines. And the government says, bet. They start increasing wages. And so eventually the bread and butter issues of higher wages and better working conditions are being met by reforms. So is socialism going to be as appealing anymore? No. Socialism is saying take over the government, redistribute property, and have the workers own the means of production. Well, it was originally very popular because the working class was being so oppressed. But now that the government is intervening on behalf of the workers, you no longer see as much of that oppression. And so the appeal of socialism is going to decrease. So labor unions are going to move towards a more moderate view of reforms. They're going to focus on bread and butter issues. What are the wages? What are the hours that we have to work? Do we get weekends off? Do we get holidays? Rather than the communist attempt at violent seizure of power. Okay, so the communist side is going to be very, very radical, and it's going to include violence. Socialism isn't as radical as communism, but it still promotes ownership of the means of production by the population that produces that product rather than by individual capitalists or industrialists. Are we good so far? All right. Later socialists are going to move away from Marxist doctrine like Edward Bernstein. He's going to be classified not as a scientific socialist, but as an evolutionary socialist. He is going to adjust some of Marx's ideas to better account for the realities of the day, including the fact that reform movements were gaining some traction. So here he says, the Communist Manifesto was correct, but we see the privileges of the capitalist bourgeoisie yielding to democratic organizations. In my judgment, success lies in a steady, peaceful advance rather than in a catastrophic crash. Now, Karl Marx predicted that the proletariat would rise up, throw off their chains, violently take over the government, and establish a new communist regime. Bernstein is saying, actually, we don't have to go the communist way. Okay, the proletariat was being exploited, but through political organization, by working within the government, we can enact change on a more gradual level and not have to resort to violence. And so he is going to reject Karl Marx's idea of a class struggle, where it's the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. And instead, he is going to promote a slow, gradual change in the government to better reflect these reforms. So that is a better definition there of socialism compared to communism. There is going to be a distinct difference between the two, okay? But one springs from the other. Communism was inspired by socialism. The utopian socialists are going to attempt to implement utopias within society. Those utopias are going to fail. And so thus Karl Marx is going to adapt socialism to a new view that emerges as communism, hence the Communist Manifesto.